Following the turmoil and civil war of the 80s, Sulla had emerged victorious and used his run as dictator to enact reforms which he hoped would prevent the rise of another Gaius Marius. However, Sulla was not a great political thinker, but rather a man of quite limited vision. The Sullan reforms were limited to formalizing the cursus honorum, which set the order of the offices in a mandatory pattern and established minimum ages for each, creating required intervals between repeat magistracies and neutering the powers of the tribunes. Almost as soon as Sulla died in 78, his political order began to unravel. In its place emerged the world of the Optimates and Populares in their fully realized form. By 60, the conditions were ripe for the emergence of a political order centered around the shared interest of the men who had grown up in a world defined by the conflict between Marius and Sulla. If you read most modern accounts of the late Republic, you will see the terms populares and optimates used and then applied in a blanket way to the entire period from the Gracchi all the way to the end of the Republic. However, this is actually anachronistic. These terms only come into use during or after the time of Sulla. So it's only really from about 80 forward where these two terms are being used broadly. And it's also worth noting that because of the strong elite bias that we know a lot more about what the Optimates thought than the Populares. And in many ways, the term popularis, or populares, to use the plural, is somewhat of a smear developed by the Optimates. So, if you look at the word popularis, this is typically rendered as populist in English. That, of course, is the singular form, popularis. And, in effect, what this describes are Roman leaders who appeal to the people and try to pass laws through the assembly. Some of the better-known populares include, well, retroactively, the Gracchi brothers, Marius, and then in terms of guys who not only acted as populares but would use that label, possibly, Julius Caesar comes to mind, Clodius, and a few others. As for the Optimates, you can guess who gave them their name. Optimates literally means the best men. Alternatively, they often referred to themselves as the boni, the good men. And in many ways, what they're referring to is their social status, the idea being that if you are well born, and if you are of noble heritage, then you must be a good person. You must be a person of quality and substance. So you can kind of see the class bias baked right into the terms themselves. Sometimes when the idea of the populares or their reputation was riding high and they had a lot of support, the Optimates would then say, we are the true populares, we're the true champions of the people. It's just that our version of championing the people happens to include not giving them any real rights, but we're actually the ones looking out for their interest, and their interests are just to serve us. The goal of the Optimates is effectively to just preserve and defend elite prerogatives. That's really what it boils down to. So if there is a proposal that would limit the powers of the Senate, they oppose it. If there's a proposal which would enhance the powers of the Senate, they are for it. And they also want to slow down anyone who tries to develop a reputation which would put them at a more prestigious level than the rest. Because of that, the Optimates, especially after 60, will develop a pretty bad habit of really promoting extremely mediocre people on the basis of their pedigree or their technical seniority due to offices achieved. And that's part of the reason why, in the end, spoilers, they don't end up prevailing. Sulla had actually retired from public life for a couple of years prior to his death. However, Rome's government was still very firmly in the hands of his close followers. The two consuls in 78, the year that Sulla died, were Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, who was a fairly close associate, and Quintus Lutatius Catulus, someone who was loyal to the cause of the Senate as defined by Sulla, but couldn't really be said to be one of the more strident followers of the former dictator. It would come as a surprise to a lot of people that as soon as Sulla was dead, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus would prove to be far more opportunistic than anyone had suspected. His first move was to try to deny Sulla a public funeral, and not only that, but argue that the former dictator should have his memory damned, that his name should be stricken from the records. Of course, Catullus and the majority of the Senate were able to shoot this proposal down and ensured that their former mentor got his proper funeral. In many ways, what Lepidus had done was to signal to the former followers of Marius, who were still quite numerous, that they had a new champion in him. That although the leaders of the Marian cause were gone, there was still a political home for the people who had voted for him and followed him. Lepidus, however, was not what we would call the first popularis necessarily, because one of the key points that most Marians supported, and that pretty much any real popularis would have to back, is the idea of having fully empowered tribunes who are able to not only protect common people from oppression in the forum, but enact legislation and transfer commands and do the other things that they had been doing prior to Sulla's reforms. However, Lepidus was not a conservative in the sense that Sulla was, because he did want to have subsidized grain for the urban plebs, something that typically tended to be opposed by the men who would become known as the Optimates. When most of Sulla's veterans revolted up in Etruria after having been settled there a few years and really having trouble with farming, Lepidus was tasked with putting down the revolt. But instead of going there and suppressing the veterans, he instead tried to make friends with them, and he effectively put himself at their head, telling them that he was going to represent their interests and make sure that their needs were taken care of. The Senate doesn't seem to have panicked at this. Perhaps it was only predictable that one of the former generals of Sulla would be loath to kill his former men. What really alarmed the Senate was when Lepidus demanded that, contrary to the rules of the Cursus Honorum as established by Sulla, he be allowed to hold a back-to-back consulship in order to keep control of the situation. The Senate quickly suspected that he intended to set himself up as a new dictator and to basically be a second Sulla, and so in order to preserve the Sullan order, ironically, it required them to prevent the rise of another dictator. And so the consul Catullus was successful in passing the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, which declared Lepidus an enemy of the state. However, Catullus was a man of modest ability, and certainly not a man of military ability, so rather than command these forces in person, he instead turned to young Pompey in order to put down Lepidus. Pompey quickly dispatched the general of Sulla, along with several other key followers. So like I said, it's not much of a conspiracy. Lepidus was fairly out in the open. He did have some pretty important followers, however, who went to the grave with him. One of them was Marcus Junius Brutus, the father of the famous assassin. Another was a member of the Scipio family. So the people who followed Lepidus were not necessarily the dregs of society. A lot of these men were men of great standing in Rome, and many of them had been on quite intimate terms with Sulla when he was alive. Speaking of Gnaeus Pompeius, or as he is typically called in English, Pompey, the young man was really on the rise in this period, and his star would rise even higher after Sulla was dead, and he was now one of the biggest names in the Roman world. At age 23 in the year 83, Pompey had raised up his father's veterans to fight for Sulla, and due to Sulla's declining health, by this point he had gout, Pompey ended up doing a whole lot of the heavy lifting in the war against Papirius Carbo and the remaining followers of Marius and Cinna. Pompey, because of his great services to Sulla, was effectively exempted from the Cursus Honorum. So, whereas everyone else had to wait until they were a certain age and they had held certain previous offices in order to seek higher offices, Pompey effectively could do whatever he pleased because he had commanded armies on Sulla's behalf and had really done services that no one else had been able to provide. And because of this, Sulla decided to give him special honors. Part of it was out of fear. He did not want to have to tangle with Pompey, especially in his current diminished state. And so, Sulla allowed this massive contradiction, the contradiction between the intent of his laws, which was to make sure that only mature men were exercising power, and the reality that Pompey was given a free pass to do as he pleased. For anyone who wanted to point out the hypocrisy of Sulla or some of the shortcomings of his arrangement, you had to look no further than the entire career of Pompey, a man who would soon become Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. However, not everyone on the Sullan side was happy to see Pompey continue to succeed and accrue honors. Many of his elders were hoping that one day the boy butcher would be sent on an assignment and he would fail, perhaps not die, but at least be humbled, and then return to his rightful place as just another senator. What they had no way to know, however, is that Pompey was an exceptionally talented man who was an excellent organizer and would truly not meet with any grand defeat for the entirety of his career. Indeed, when we eventually get to how he loses the civil war with Caesar, we'll see that he actually was winning right up until the point where he lost at the last minute. Pompey was one of the best strategists of his era, and arguably of the entire ancient Roman period. Although the Sullans seemed to have a pretty firm grip on Rome and also on most of the Republic's holdings, there was one huge exception, and that was Roman Spain. Here, the Marians had dispatched a praetor named Quintus Sertorius in order to keep control of this area for their faction. Sertorius had actually been driven out at one point, but then in 80 he managed to make his way back into Spain and set up a rival regime. Here, he not only was able to defy the Sullans and keep them occupied, but he even managed to set up a rival senate composed of Roman settlers in the area, and was able to defy the authority of the Roman Senate for several years. The Sertorian War will last from 80 to 73. For years, Rome continued to hurl large armies into Spain in the hopes of dislodging Sertorius, and year after year they were defied and humiliated by the tactical brilliance of Quintus Sertorius. One of his victims was Metellus Pius, the son of Metellus Numidicus. Metellus Pius was not very successful in dealing with Sertorius, so the Senate dispatched young Pompey, their ace general, in order to end the war. However, Pompey too ended up getting defeated by Sertorius in a couple of battles. While Pompey would eventually meet his end at the hands of Julius Caesar, the fact is that only one man ever truly exposed his tactical limitations, and that man was Quintus Sertorius. Sertorius was actually surrounded at one point by Metellus Pius and Pompey, and despite being surrounded, he managed to defeat each army in detail. Sertorius was the kind of general who could not be forced to fight when he didn't want to, and once engaged in an open battle tended to win despite having a mostly inferior force. Eventually, Pompey and Metellus were able to suborn Sertorius' number 2 in command, a man named Perperna, and Perperna ended up murdering Sertorius and then turning himself over to the authorities. One of the things that Pompey uncovered when he arrived in camp was that Sertorius had been engaged in a considerable amount of correspondence with many senators back in Rome, which means that Sertorius was winning a lot of street cred back at home due to all his success, and also, despite the triumph of the Sullans several years earlier, there were plenty of people who were still willing to entertain the notion of taking a more Marian line in order to pick up the voters that were now left unrepresented. So, because this would have been such an embarrassment and a scandal, and perhaps because there were letters from himself or some of his allies among these letters, Pompey decided to burn all the letters in order to prevent another major political crisis back in Rome. In the year 73 BCE, not only were the Romans still busy wrapping up the Sertorian War, but they were embarking upon the Third Mithridatic War in the east. This means that most of their best generals and their best legions were abroad. It is in this context that we have the Third Servile War, also known as Spartacus's Revolt. There was a gladiator school at Capua, it wasn't that different than many of the other gladiator schools that had risen up around Italy. For the most part, gladiators had become something of an obsession in Rome, and every time there was a major public entertainment, it was expected that the people hosting it would furnish gladiator shows. So, the people who bought and trained gladiators would set up schools in cities around Italy, train their gladiators, and then bring them to Rome or other places for special events. This means that there are a lot of slaves who are not only armed, but are kept specifically for the purpose of fighting. Many of them are POWs. So some of them were, say, Thracians or Gauls who were caught in battle and then sold as gladiators. And so you've got a lot of people who potentially have reason to revolt. They don't want to meet their end at the hands of a fickle crowd. And there's also a further incentive in the fact that, as we've mentioned before, the Roman countryside had been largely denuded of free men who held arms, which meant that if a group of gladiators were to escape with their weapons, they could engage in brigandage, and they would be very hard to bring to justice. Well, Spartacus, who was a Thracian, and Crixus, who was a Gaul, and some other gladiators managed to escape from Capua. They killed the people who owned the school. They escaped, and then they were attacked by a local Roman militia. At first, it looked like the militia had them trapped, but Spartacus led a group of men around the rear. They managed to surprise and rout this small Roman militia. They captured their weapons. This inspired confidence, and other slaves started flocking to the banner. The revolt began to pick up speed, and the Romans continued to respond in inadequate ways, which ultimately just fueled this crisis, as it became apparent that the Romans were vulnerable and lacked any real leadership in this crisis. The man who would ultimately decide to try to take the bull by the horns was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome at the time. Crassus was something of a slumlord. He was a guy who had made his living, well, mostly through inheritance, but he had made more money by investing heavily in cheap apartment buildings. And many of these apartment buildings were so poorly built that they collapsed and killed the tenants inside, but that didn't prevent Crassus from collecting rent and enhancing his fortune even more. But now he wanted some military glory, something that he had not achieved up to this point. And he wanted to win that glory at the expense of these revolted slaves. So he raised an army on his own dime, which just shows how exactly rich this guy was, because to raise an army through one's personal resources requires a truly insane amount of wealth. So Crassus, despite having some setbacks in the war, and despite getting lucky when Spartacus and Crixus decided to split up and go their separate ways because of a strategic disagreement, eventually Crassus is able to pin down Spartacus in South Italy and prevent him from crossing the Sicily. And when Spartacus tried to break out, Crassus was able to kill him in battle and defeat most of his followers. So although it was a very sloppy victory which showed that Crassus was no real general, it was a victory nonetheless, and it did enhance Crassus' standing. However, late in 71, not long after Crassus defeated Spartacus, some of Spartacus' followers were trying to leave Italy via the north when they were intercepted by Pompey, who had returned from Spain. And Pompey managed to pick off a group of several thousand stragglers who were fleeing out of Italy. And because of his high reputation in Rome at the time with the people, he ended up getting credit for winning the whole war. And this would now create a rivalry between Pompey and Crassus, who, by the way, were both popular enough to be elected consul together in the year 70. Going into the consulship of Pompey and Crassus, Crassus hated Pompey from the outset due to his anger over the way that Pompey got credit for winning the war with Spartacus. After Crassus treated Pompey with derision for a while, Pompey learned to hate him back, and in due time, they found themselves bitter foes. They would remain bitter foes for a full decade. The most notable achievement during this year was the full restoration of the powers of the tribunes. And with the restoration of the power of the tribunes, who could now do what tribunes such as Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus could do, with this restoration of their powers, and with the ending of the Sullan restriction that anyone who served as tribune could never go higher in the hierarchy, the core of Sulla's legislation was finally dead. At this point, the Cursus Sinorum still held true, at least for everybody except Pompey, but the core of Sulla's legislation, that is pinning the blame for all the problems of the past on the tribunes, that is now dead. And effectively, we still have the same situation that obtained prior to the civil war between Marius and Sulla, where you have professional legions who will be loyal to generals and will need to have land and other benefits from the Senate, but where you have a Senate where there's a lot of jealousy over anyone who has more success than their peers. So, the problems will continue, and the fixes proposed by Sulla, which did not work anyway, had now been discarded. So Rome was simply going to stumble along and hope for the best, even while realizing that there was a fatal flaw at hand. By the late Republic, neglecting major problems until they blew up and got completely out of control had become a well-established tradition. And one problem that the Romans had been systematically ignoring for years was the problem of piracy. Prior to this, a young Julius Caesar had been actually captured by pirates and had to ransom himself. So this was something that had been affecting members of the Senate, and yet the Senate remained largely uninterested. The reason why piracy had gotten so out of control is that the Romans did not maintain much of a fleet themselves, and they had deprived all of their allies and neighbors of fleets, lest those fleets be used against their own interest. What they failed to realize or account for is that most naval forces were used to combat piracy. And so, once they did away with the Rhodian fleet and all of the other fleets, this meant that pirates were free to roam the Mediterranean at will. This not only affected commerce and grain shipments to Rome, but eventually the pirates got so bold that in 68 they actually sailed into Ostia, which is effectively the port of Rome. They burned the Roman fleet there, and they even took 2 senators captive in order to ransom them. Now Rome finally panicked, and the Senate decided that the time was right to act. And when I say the Senate, I actually mean the people. A tribune named Gabinius decided to grant Pompey unprecedented powers in order to deal with this crisis. The people were truly terrified, and there was now the prospect of being starved out because the grain wouldn't arrive. And so, Pompey received authority over all Roman forces within 50 miles of the coast, which, for all practical intents and purposes, means all the Roman forces on land and sea in the entire Mediterranean. This was a wild degree of power that no one had ever held before, and if you are a detractor of Pompey or someone who's worried about maintaining the balance of power in the Senate, this is worrying. If you are an opponent of Pompey, you are probably very worried at this point because he now has the ability to potentially make himself dictator for life, something that Sulla wouldn't do. However, to the shock of everyone for various reasons, both because of how quickly he resolved the problem and because he laid down this power as quickly as possible, Pompey was actually able to bring this campaign to a conclusion in just 3 months. Most people assume this would last for a long time, but again, Pompey was a brilliant organizer and strategist, and so he was able to bring the pirates to heel in just 3 months, mostly by using threats and using a carrot and stick approach. There weren't actually all that many battles during this period. So what he did is he offered to resettle many of the pirates into towns and to give them work in various places. So some of them settled down into uninhabited areas and founded cities. He also found other arrangements that didn't involve violence. This really shortened the campaign. For the pirates who would not submit peacefully, of course, he just dealt with them militarily. So Pompey really demonstrated the full extent of his abilities during this period with the Gabinian Law. However, one thing that we've learned about the Romans, if nothing else, is that anything that happens sets a precedent that can be used to justify something in the future. And so, ironically enough, this Gabinian Law would be one of the major precedents that Augustus drew upon when he was putting together the package of powers that enabled him to be emperor without holding a monarchical title. He effectively claimed proconsular authority comparable to that held by Pompey, and he claimed a similar kind of power. So, talk about unintended consequences, especially given the future of the relationship between Pompey and Octavius's uncle, Julius Caesar. In 73, the same year that the Romans concluded the Sertorian War, they embarked upon another war in the east. Mithridates, the old foe of Sulla, was back, and this time it was one of Sulla's chief lieutenants, Lucius Licinius Lucullus, who was entrusted with the conduct of this war. He would command for an unusually long period of time, all the way down to the year 66, and for the first 5 or so years of the war he was actually making excellent progress. He managed not only to defend Rome's territories, but to drive Mithridates out of Pontus, his home territory, in the north of what is now Turkey. However, during the winter of 68 to 67, Lucullus was bogged down in a lengthy siege, and Mithridates, who had fled to the neighboring kingdom of Armenia to meet with one of his in-laws, returned with an army and managed to upset a lot of the Roman progress, defeating Lucullus in a battle and inflicting about 7,000 losses. Lucullus did manage to make good his losses because he was a very good organizer, but the damage was done. Pompey, who now has no command and is kind of getting bored and restless, wants to get back in on the action. So in 66, a tribune favorable to Pompey proposes that the command be transferred, and so the war against Pontus and Armenia is now in the hands of Pompey. He will now spend the next several years in the east. Meanwhile, Lucullus goes back to Rome, and rather than trying to undermine Pompey or even really be involved politically, he retires to a life of pleasure. If you read Plutarch's Life of Lucullus, we see that Lucullus invents many novel pleasures, including the artificial stocking of fish ponds. Interestingly enough, Lucullus's command is highly irregular. This is the first super extended campaign. So in many ways, although Lucullus is supposed to be an upholder of tradition and Rome's old ways, he is inadvertently one of the great innovators. Without Lucullus's example of having an extended campaign year after year after year, it's hard to imagine someone doing what Julius Caesar did and having an entire decade within which to try to conquer Gaul. So once again, we have someone who's ostensibly conservative setting a precedent that is then used by someone who's ostensibly a popularis and will kind of bring the Republic to a close. So Pompey, for the next few years, manages to finish off Mithridates. It was kind of a downhill struggle from that point. Not only had Lucullus done a lot of the heavy lifting, but Pompey brings in reinforcements. He then decides in the year 63 to do a tour of the coast of the Levant. So he goes down the coast of what is now Syria and Israel, and Jordan and a couple other countries. The first stop is what remains of the Seleucid Empire. By this point, the Seleucid Empire is little more than Antioch and its suburbs, and Pompey stops by, meets the last Seleucid emperor, and effectively tells him, "Your independence is over. This is pathetic. I'm annexing this kingdom. Please and thank you." And the Seleucids, by this point, are in absolutely no condition to resist, so they surrender. He then goes south to the Hasmonean kingdom. This was an independent Jewish kingdom in what is now Jerusalem. They had been independent since the time of the Seleucid ruler Antiochus IV, so maybe about a century. Right now, they're engaged in a civil war. Pompey comes in, takes a side, and concludes a siege of Jerusalem in 63 BCE. Pretty easy campaign for Pompey. A lot of people make a good amount of noise about it because it happened in Israel and, of course, in the capital city of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But for Pompey, this would have been one of the least significant campaigns of his entire career. There simply was no way that Hasmonean forces would have any meaningful chance against a Roman legion. So, pretty easy campaign, all things considered, and in many ways, Pompey did what Caesar later claimed to do. He came, he saw, he conquered. Wasn't a lot of fighting, at least not any kind of fighting that would really endanger Pompey or his men in any meaningful way. At this point, Pompey has now officially become one of the greatest conquerors in Roman history. He was just over 40 years old, and it's really only at this point in his life where he actually, had he followed the Cursus Honorum, this is about when he would actually be eligible for his first consulship. So other men of his generation are just now getting to the point where they'll have a 1-year window to try to achieve fame, and Pompey has already made it. He also decides that while he really enjoys being in command and he's got a lot of talent militarily, that he's done enough, and he just wants to go back to Rome and bask in his glory. He just wants to be appreciated, heard out in the Senate, and he assumes that everyone there will be grateful for all the things that he's done for Rome. It's worth noting that for all of his military genius, Pompey was politically extremely naive at times, and so he thought that people would be willing to help him settle his veterans and confirm all his agreements in the East, and that everyone would sing Kumbaya and get along, but that is not how things played out, as we'll see. Rome was about to have its second major conspiracy in just 15 years. As I mentioned before, I don't really see how the conspiracy of Lepidus was much of a conspiracy, but in the case of the conspiracy of Catiline, there was a good deal of secret plotting. Lucius Sergius Catilina, or Catiline as he is typically called in English, was a deeply indebted patrician whose family had been out of politics for generations. It was only in his own time that he had managed to get the family back into the Senate, and most of his wealth had come from being a Sullan enforcer and being a headhunter during the proscriptions. So he had managed to build up the family fortune sufficiently to get into the Senate, and he was a guy with a decent amount of charisma, so he was able to win all the offices up to and including praetor. However, when it came time for him to run for consul, he found that he was one of the poorer guys in the race, and so he had to borrow large sums of money in order to compete. He ran in 63 and lost, and then he decided to run again in 62. Now, typically, men who were not terribly wealthy, at least by the standards of the Senate, including men like Julius Caesar, by the way, would hope for a proconsular command after they had served as consul, during which they could gain wealth by either extorting the provincials for tax revenue or else by winning plunder as a military commander, and then use that money to repay their debts that they had accrued in order to become consul. So, basically, without the prospect of getting a proconsular command, Catiline was effectively screwed. Ironically enough, his political appeal was that he was going to relieve debt. By this point, many Romans were swimming in debt, and this included Romans of all classes, not just senators who had run and lost for major offices. At the same time, Catiline and his call for debt relief has really pissed off a lot of people in the Senate, many of whom benefit from collecting interest on debt and usury. And they found a champion in Marcus Tullius Cicero, a man who had once been something of a popularis speaker. He was a new man, and he became the plebeian consul of 63. So he saw Catiline as something of a contemporary and a rival, even though at one point a couple years earlier he had contemplated becoming an ally of Catiline and kind of running as a tandem, with Catiline being the patrician and Cicero being the plebeian. But over time he had turned on Catiline because he saw that the other senators that he was so desperately trying to impress and fit in with were horrified by Catiline's debt relief proposals, and so he became Catiline's most viciously outspoken critic. People started coming to Cicero with rumors and whispers that Catiline was plotting something. He might try to start some fire at the Capitol in order to murder key senators and seize power, or else erase the debt records, or murder Cicero and his colleague in order to take control and get what he thought was rightfully his, or some other convoluted plot. And it does look like there was something in the works. Catiline and his henchmen, however, were rather clumsy and heavy-handed. They talked to various prostitutes about their plans, and they also approached some Gallic ambassadors and said, hey, don't worry about meeting with the Senate, meet with us, we'll be in charge soon. And of course, these guys came off as clowns to the Allobroge ambassadors, so then they went straight to Cicero and reported all this. So Cicero actually confronts Catiline in the Senate with these charges, and this is the occasion of a famous portrait, or painting, where you have Catiline sitting by himself and all the other senators trying to move as far away from him as possible while Cicero is denouncing him in public. This is recorded, and we can read it today as the first Catilinarian oration. Catiline, however, despite being driven out of Rome on all of these charges, then goes and gathers his supporters. Now, he had his men out in the countryside trying to rouse support, and not as many men as he had hoped end up showing up. But one group that he got were the broke ex-Sullan farmers who still couldn't quite figure out how to farm successfully. So most of his supporters were poor men living in Etruria, and so he joined them and had a small army. But now Cicero sent his colleague and one of the praetors after Catiline, and so he's got to find a place to run to or he has to fight. Ultimately, Catiline is cornered and destroyed along with his followers, several thousand in number, in a field battle. So, Cicero then basically starts to act as if he's the greatest hero to ever live. He even tries to get someone to make an epic poem about his consulship. When no one will take up the task, he actually writes one himself. And despite Cicero's reputation as both an orator and a man of letters, it turns out that he really sucked at poetry, to the point that it's one of the few things that he wrote that was not preserved, and also universally every report that we have about it makes fun of it and says that it's one of the worst poems ever written. This also would come back to haunt Cicero, however, as he had utilized the SCU, and had also executed a number of Catiline's senatorial supporters, and later on, several years down the line, this will be used against him in order to send him into exile. But that goes beyond the boundary of this video, which focuses on the years between 80 and 60. The best account that we have of the Catilinarian conspiracy comes to us from the historian Sallust. Sallust tells us that the two rising stars of the late 60s were Gaius Julius Caesar and Marcus Porcius Cato the Younger. These two men stood head and shoulders above the rest in the debate over what to do with Catiline's supporters. During that debate, Caesar had suggested keeping these men imprisoned in cities around Italy, since that would inflict the maximum humiliation and spare Cicero and others the opprobrium of executing Roman citizens without a trial. He also thought that it would be more humiliating and would deprive them of a martyr's death. This seemed to be gaining steam with most of the senators. They thought that Caesar spoke well. But then Cato stood up and delivered a rabble-rousing speech where he basically said that the Roman way is to stamp out opposition and to not tolerate any dissension or treason or anything of the sort. And he basically accused Caesar, in no uncertain terms, of being in league with Catiline. Otherwise, he would be pro-death. Cato was very persuasive, but only with fellow senators. And he was persuasive enough with his fellow senators that some of them actually were ready to murder Caesar, so Cicero had to literally save Caesar's life in this instance, an action that I'm sure he regretted in later years. These two men, however, did represent opposite political styles, and they were the most iconic figures of their generation, even if they weren't necessarily the greatest at this point in time. Caesar was a man for all seasons. He had a very well-rounded political game. He was an excellent backroom politician. He was also an excellent speaker, second or third only to someone like Cicero and maybe Hortensius. And in time, he'd also proved to be a very capable general. He had kind of the full package of attributes that you would want in a politician. He was good at charming people in private. He was also good at addressing audiences. He just had all the skills one could ever hope for. Cato, on the other hand, while he was a capable soldier and also a pretty capable guy in general, he was very stiff and upright. He was the kind of guy who was unwilling to bend rules or to acknowledge that the world that he lived in was anything other than Plato's Republic. Cicero once famously said that Cato looked around Romulus' swamp and saw Plato's Republic. But despite Cato's shortcomings as a politician, he was very much admired by his fellow senators because he was extremely consistent and he very fervently believed what he said. And since what he believed is that men like him should have unlimited power and that everyone who tried to challenge that should be put to death, it's not hard to see why many men in the Senate looked to Cato as an inspiration. However, we should be very hesitant about overestimating Cato's importance. A lot of his importance really is something that was read into the situation in retrospect by men from Sallust onwards. Cato exudes a kind of aura and had a certain charisma, but he actually was not the most high-ranking guy among the Optimates. He was outranked by Bibulus, Caesar's great rival and co-consul. He was outranked by Catullus before his death. He was outranked by Metellus Scipio, who we'll talk about at a later date in more detail. He was outranked by many people in his own faction, and so he was never the leader. He was more of the mascot, really. And I think that's important to understand that. As for Caesar, as we'll discuss, he actually starts out as the junior partner in what will become the First Triumvirate. But now the question becomes, how do we get from a fallen Sullan order and these divided power centers with a super successful Pompey to the First Triumvirate? What series of events leads to this formation? By the end of the 60s, the Optimates had come up with their winning political strategy. This strategy was, in short, pure obstructionism. The idea, and I'm not sure whether it came from Catullus or Cato the Younger or Bibulus or Metellus Scipio, but one or all of them had decided that the only surefire solution is to prevent any achievement on the part of one's enemies that might empower that person and thereby endanger the power of the Optimates and the Senate as a whole. This means, literally, that if someone achieves something that could redound to the benefit of all Romans, but that person is someone they don't like and who might become more prestigious because of it, you stop that dead in its tracks, even if this does not directly harm you. So this level of obstructionism is certain to cause problems. You would think that having lived through things such as the Social War, where Rome refused to make needed demands in the face of massive pressure from the Allies and many threats, you would think that after living through something like that, or the war with Spartacus, or the civil wars between Marius and Sulla, or any number of other scandals of recent years, you would think that many people would realize that pure obstructionism like this is bound to cause a rupture. That is bound to create pressure that will inevitably explode. But apparently the wise men running the Optimates did not see things that way. They thought that if you just ignore a problem long enough, it will go away. If you ignore the pirates long enough, maybe they'll show up at Ostia. Who knows? So, in their infinite wisdom, they decided to do everything in their power to stymie the ambitions of the people they didn't like. 3 of the people they didn't like were Marcus Crassus, Pompey, and Julius Caesar. Crassus had not been consul in 10 years, and as he was getting older, he was probably now in his early 50s, he knows that his window of opportunity is starting to close. And he's still dreaming of glory. At this point, he's not even really the richest man in Rome, because Pompey is probably about as rich, if not slightly richer, after his eastern campaigns. And so Crassus doesn't know exactly how to get back to the consulship so that way he can get a proconsular command and win some glory. But that's something that he's very interested in doing. He's sick of merely being the moneylender who helps other people become consul. Pompey has achieved great things, and he is ready to kind of hang up his boots. However, he still needs to finalize his achievements. He's got many veterans who need to get land, and he also has arrangements in the east that he made that need to be ratified by the Senate. But because those things would make him more prestigious by confirming what he had already done, the Senate refuses to cooperate. And so Pompey now has veterans who are becoming increasingly upset, which is never a good thing. And he's got treaties that are hanging in midair, waiting to add to the territorial size of the Republic, but for some reason the Senate won't sign them. So it's very frustrating, and Pompey's the kind of guy who was very slow to realize that just achieving a bunch of stuff would not win the admiration or love of his contemporaries. It took him a long time to realize that jealousy was a huge problem for many of his contemporaries, and that they did not want him to succeed too much. It's really only around this time that he finally learns that lesson fully. There's also Julius Caesar. He was a well-known popularis. He was the nephew by marriage of Gaius Marius, and he had played that up for years to maximum effect. And now he will be eligible to be consul in the year 59. When he initially arrives home in 60, he wants to run for consul, but first he wants to celebrate a triumph for his deeds while praetor in what is now Portugal, what was called Lusitania at the time. However, due to the influence of Cato and others, the Senate told him that either he could celebrate his triumph or run for office, but not both. And they came up with some ridiculous technicality to prevent him from doing both. And despite the fact that Caesar, as Pontifex Maximus at this time, could have probably beat them on the technicalities, he decided to just forego his triumph and instead focus on trying to become consul. However, he was not one of the wealthier senators, so he needed money, and one of the guys he would go to for money is his longtime friend Marcus Crassus. And eventually he decides he wants to get the backing of Pompey also, so he decides, well, what if I tell Pompey I will help him get all of his stuff passed? And then it occurs to him, I need to form a supergroup with Pompey and Crassus to get stuff done. Both of them have immense power, wealth, and prestige. I'm the one who has most of the charisma and political savvy. So if we combine forces, and then I can heal the breach between these two guys who hate each other, we can become an unstoppable force. Especially if we go out and get a bunch of young guys to do a lot of the legwork as tribunes and doing other stuff. And so, he summons Pompey and Crassus to a town called Lucca, and they negotiate and eventually form what becomes known as the First Triumvirate. But that will be a story that we tell on a different day. Until then, I'm Thersites the Historian.